Hi, my name is Nick Benedict, and I'm a board member with the Secular Students Alliance. And the first thing I want to do is thank you for your attendance and participation and engagement today at this very important conference. And at the second point, I just want to encourage you if this year has taught us anything, it's the importance of having a secular perspective in both campus and national affairs. Certainly, there's no time as much as the present that calls for scientific decision-making, use of objective flat facts instead of superstition and sloganeering, and involving all perspectives in the current, what hopefully could become a dialogue in this country. So if I could encourage you to make a donation, especially a monthly recurring donation, the idea there that it allows us to have some kind of predictable and stable planning going forward really increases the types of programs that we can offer if we've got that kind of certainty. So thank you again for participating, and it's very much appreciated.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me do that, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our final day of the Secular Student Alliance virtual conference. It's been a great week so far, and today we're going to really finish strong with some amazing presentations, starting right now with Katherine Stewart. Katherine has graciously agreed to be a part of this with us, and we're so excited. I read her book during quarantine, and it's such a fantastic read. She's the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Sometimes it's hard to see these things, but here's the, see the picture just disappears. Anyway, there's her book. I hope you will go and get it and read it. She's been featured on broadcast outlets, including National Public Radio, MSNBC, and the BBC. Her work has appeared in the New York Times opinion section, the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, and the Washington Post. Katherine, it's great to have you with us. And we're really looking forward to your presentation and a chance to ask you a few questions. If you have questions, which I'm sure you will, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and ask your questions there. If you're on social media, on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, please go ahead and ask your question. Ask your questions in the comment section of those platforms, and we will do our best to include your question in the Q&A. But Katherine, again, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for being here on a Saturday, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thanks to
I don't hear you. Why don't I hear you?
Let me just.
Oh, yes, you're fine.
Okay. I want to thank you, Ryan, and the Secular Student Alliance for inviting me to participate this afternoon. And I want to thank all of you watching and acknowledge all of you for taking the time to connect at this especially challenging moment. Apart from the dysfunction we're seeing every day in our politics and the unending struggle for justice, most of us by now know someone who's been sickened or even killed by this horrible disease. We don't really know what school is going to look like in 2021. The fact that so many of you have tuned in for this talk, even as there are so many issues deserving of your attention, gives me hope. We all care deeply about our country and its future, and we care about one another. And that's why I'm here today to discuss the threat of religious nationalism in America. I want to talk for about 20-25 minutes, focusing on some of the most salient features of the Christian nationalist movement. I'm going to discuss what we can do to meet these challenges, and then I'm hoping to have plenty of time for your questions. But first, I want to address why this movement reserves a special contempt for the secular. The consensus is still in some quarters to view the religious right through a culture war frame, focused on issues like abortion and LGBT equality, and those issues matter. But what we're really looking at here is Christian nationalism, which ties the idea of America to certain approved religious and cultural identities and basically says that America is founded on the Bible. It's really about power. It's not just about those culture war issues. Religious nationalism is fundamentally incompatible with modern constitutional democracy. It rejects equality and the idea of a just and pluralist society that our Constitution is meant to uphold. Religious nationalism divides us from them, the supposedly pure from the supposedly impure, and it focuses the grievances of its base on demonic or dehumanized others. So who are these others? Well, the number one threat, as they see it, is secularists, atheists, the non-religious. I mean, there are other targets singled out for hate too. Progressive Christians get their fair share of contempt. Movement leaders are always decrying the false theology of progressive people of faith. America's religious minority groups are another easy target, and they're constantly warning against what they call radical feminists and LGBT totalitarians. One of my favorite little phrases that I've heard a number of times. But when they're looking for a single target to blame, an internal enemy upon whom to focus their rage and hate, it's secularists who are supposedly out there ransacking everything that's holy and good in our society. And they'll conflate liberal and progressive politics with an absence of a belief in their God. They call it atheistic, and they mean that as an insult. Think about the well-connected evangelist and commentator Franklin Graham, who said, progressive, that's just another word for godless. So, the religious right's political leaders understand that when people are secular, they reject the authority of religion in public affairs. They're likely to reject the justification for political, economic, and legal theories that the Christian nationalists are using to consolidate their own power and that of their political allies and the movement's deep-pocketed funders. Not only that, but today, if you look at partisan identification, it's almost as big a separator as race. 76% of the so-called nuns have been voting for Democrats. It's almost as predictive as, it's even more predictive than being female. Being secular means you're not going to support a political system that is based on reactionary religion and that derives its justification in appeals to reactionary religion. Trump knows this. He would not have won the election in 2016 without the support of this movement. And he will do whatever he can to maintain their support. To appreciate the power that the movement has in his administration, all we need to do is look at Trump's cabinet. Take Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Under the guise of religious liberty, Pompeo is pushing repressive ideas that offer cover to authoritarian regimes around the world. Pompeo's declared aim is to make religious liberty count as America's first freedom and as the central pillar of its international human rights policy. Well, that sounds great and inspiring, right? But unfortunately, religious liberty, the sort of idea of religious liberty in the mouths of so many cabinet leaders in the Trump administration really means something like religious privilege, not freedom of conscience and thought and worship as we all understand religious liberty to mean, but a kind of privileging of their form of religion and its ability to sort of trump the law. So for years now, leaders of America's religious right have been making the spurious claim that the Constitution is written in the language of natural law and that it entitles them not only to discriminate against people of whom they do not approve, but also to receive a steady stream of public funds, of taxpayer money, in the form of unique subsidies, exemptions, vouchers, grants, and other means. They've also aggressively cultivated the conviction that they themselves are the victims of persecution. Pompeo has established a commission on unalienable rights under his watch as Secretary of State. Now, this sounds great, but a glance at the roster of the commissioners makes clear the purpose of his effort. 7 out of 12 of his commissioners, according to analysis by LGBT rights organization GLAAD, were already on record expressing hostility to LGBT equality. The chair of the commission, Mary Ann Glendon, is a former ambassador to the Vatican. She firmly opposes women's reproductive freedom and once suggested that honoring the Boston Globe reporters for their work in exposing an epidemic of child abuse among Catholic priests would be like awarding the Nobel Peace Prize, as she called it, to Osama bin Laden. She actually said that exposing a network of child abusers and exposing incidents of child abuse is like giving the Peace Prize to Osama bin Laden. Pompeo's commission and other efforts to promote religious freedom will not only undermine the rights of many people around the world, it will also promote some authoritarian regimes at the expense of democratic movements and diminish still further America's credibility as a champion of democracy at home and abroad. Now, let's take a look at Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr. Barr delivered an infamous speech at Notre Dame Law School in which he blamed secularists for moral chaos and immense suffering, wreckage, and misery. Mr. Barr's views contribute to how he's directed his Justice Department on matters concerning the First Amendment clause forbidding the establishment of a state religion. He told these law students at Notre Dame, "We keep an eye out for cases or events around the country where states are misapplying the Establishment Clause in a way that discriminates against people of faith." The people of faith he's referring to are almost invariably people who hold reactionary beliefs, not people who happen to have a sincerely held belief in equality of all and things like that. So Barr, like other members of Trump's cabinet, has embraced wholesale the religious liberty rhetoric of today's Christian nationalist movement. The freedom they have in mind is the freedom of people of certain conservative and authoritarian varieties of religion to discriminate against those over whom they wish to exert power. This kind of religious liberty seeks to foment the sense of persecution and paranoia that serves to unite the Christian nationalist base. It also serves to justify public funding for their religion. More than anything, the longer I research this movement, I can see that it's about access to public money. At Christian nationalist gatherings and strategy meetings, the Democratic Party and its supporters are often described as demonic and associated with rulers of the darkness, with the devil. If you sincerely believe that society is under dire existential threat from secularists, and you're persuaded that they're about to destroy everything that's holy and good in our society, they can justify to themselves every ethical breach, every backroom deal, etc. And this brings us back to the issue of authoritarianism. People continue asking how the religious right can stand behind a leader like Trump, who's got a long, I don't even know where to begin, long history of doing and saying things that no so-called values voter should want to support. In fact, Trump's clear disdain for the rules is part of the appeal. His transparently amoral character makes him the ideal leader of a religious nationalist state. He represents the lawlessness of the authoritarian. He puts himself above the law and is therefore representative of the authoritarian impulses of his supporters. So this is a movement that's always, associating everything they dislike with atheism. And they've done this for centuries. Let's go back in history and we'll to the sort of origins of the idea of America as a so-called Christian nation and how that played out. So a couple centuries back, it was America's pro-slavery theologians who actually promoted the idea of our country as an authentically and Orthodox Christian nation with hierarchies rooted in the Bible. Now, they too cast abolitionists as heretics and atheists. The pro-slavery theologian James Henley Thornwell put it this way. He said, the parties in this conflict, he was describing the conflict between abolitionists and pro-slavery theologians and slaveholders. He said, the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They're atheists, socialists, communists on the one side, that was the side of the abolitionists, he was saying, and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. So he's putting abolitionism on the side of atheism, which he thought was a bad thing, and slaveholders on the side of order and regulated freedom. It is really perverse. and sort of hits home the fact that, even then it was a movement that derided equality, just has no respect for equality. Well, let's fast forward to the civil rights era, and we can actually kind of see a common thread. Those who opposed equality for Black citizens, the segregationists, called those who were fighting against injustice and racism atheistic. Bob Jones Jr. delivered a radio address in 1960 titled, "Is Segregation Scriptural?" In this radio address, he declared that God is the author of segregation. He said that, and he called segregation God's established order. Jones referred to desegregationists as satanic propagandists and religious infidels who wanted to overthrow the established order of God. I mean, you can kind of see a through line here, can't you? And you can see some of those same theocratic arguments used yet again today to support other forms of injustice. Let's fast forward again to the 1980s, when the influential theologian and radio personality D. James Kennedy, are any of you familiar with him? He, by the way, received at least $5.5 million in donations from the family of Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos. So let's sort of understand that going forward. He delivered an address in 1986 and was published in a pamphlet. It was all about public education, how terrible it is in his view. And he wrote that public education was atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, and anti-American. Are you guys sensing a theme here? Because I am. And look what DeVos is doing to public education today. So this does get at something else. The religious right is aiming squarely at public schools. Their efforts to degrade public education, to put it under stress and push it to the point of breaking is really glaring today, especially with their demands that every single public school just open up face-to-face 5 days a week in person. And meanwhile, schools are struggling to have the resources to be able to do that. I mean, their longstanding contempt for public education is rooted in hostility to pluralism, equality, critical thinking, respect for science, and the values of the Enlightenment. Now, those values, ironically, are baked into our founding principles. They have been applied imperfectly over time, to be sure, but the extent to which we can pursue them, we spread justice and achieve great things. And whenever we try the opposite, religious authoritarianism, we spread injustice and pain. I've been researching and writing about this movement for a dozen years. I have attended innumerable right-wing conferences, strategy meetings, and gatherings. I think, I'm an investigative journalist first. I go out there and I gather information firsthand. I think listening is underrated. You can learn a lot about a movement, not just when its leaders are speaking to the general public, but when they're talking to one another in the forums that they share, when they're talking to sympathetic audiences. So let me tell you about an incident in 2019 when I found myself at the Values Voters Summit in a Washington, D.C. hotel. The Values Voters Summit is an annual gathering of religious right activists. So we're standing there in line waiting to hear Trump speak. He's speaking at a special dinner that evening. This was a ticketed event and the tickets were expensive, fairly expensive. So the folks in line tended to be the higher level activists. At one point, I was standing near two men who seemed to be political strategists of some sort. And one was saying to the other, we need a young woman of color who can run on the I'm sort of paraphrasing here. He said, we need a young woman of color who can run on the Democratic ticket in our state, and who appears to be a Democrat, but is pro-life and has Republican positions. And once she's in office, she's going to act like a Republican. And he said, so if you see someone like that, send her our way so we can sort of groom her and prepare her to run for political office. And this incident really reminded me of the fact that today's religious right not only operates with a fairly high level of strategic thinking, it's pretty devious if you think about it, right? But that it also relies on misdirection and deceit. Then I entered the ballroom where, the tableware was sparkling. We sat down at our tables, the steak was served, and Trump came on stage to wild applause. His speech was a characteristic combination of bluster, fabrication, hyper-partisan attacks on Democrats and atheists or anyone who happens to oppose his agenda in any way, including Republicans who happen to cross his path, all of whom are characterized not as people with opposing points of view, but as dehumanized, almost demonic internal enemies of the state. And he was met with adoring standing ovations from the crowd. People keep asking how the religious right can continue to stand behind him. In fact, Trump's clear disdain for the rules is part of his appeal. Trump's transparently immoral character makes him the ideal leader of a religious national state. He represents the lawlessness of the authoritarian, putting himself above the law. Just a few days ago, in an interview with Fox News, Trump said, if Joe Biden wins, there's no more religion. Can you imagine? I mean, that sounds absurd to us. We know it's not true. We know so many religious folks who are actually anchor their progressive values in their faith. But this is how religious nationalists work. It's us versus them, the pure versus the impure, the insiders versus the outsiders, the supposedly righteous versus the secularists. So how did we get here? This powerful movement that we see today is the consequence of decades of investment in all the tools of modern campaign infrastructure. A lot of people, it goes back to what I said earlier, people think about the religious right when they're opposing abortion or LGBT equality, but in fact, this movement is a political machine. And it's a political machine with many components, including religious right policy groups, networking groups, media and legislative initiatives, legal and data organizations, and the like. So I want to talk a little bit about how the machinery works through churches. Leaders of the movement have figured out that pastors drive votes. And so they organize pastors into networks that get them all on the same page politically. I want to give you an idea of what that looks like on the ground. Recently, I attended a pastors networking event at a church in rural North Carolina with dozens of evangelical pastors from the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter in elections and the biblically correct way to vote on them. They know very well they can get people to vote on one or two issues. You can control their vote. So the event is trying to get people to these pastors to understand these are the key issues you got to get your congregations to vote on, and here's how to turn them out. The event was organized by an organization called Watchmen on the Wall. It's a project of the Family Research Council. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them. It's one of the most powerful policy groups of the Christian right. Watchmen on the Wall claims to have over 27,000 pastor members, each of whom manages a different congregation. I think the numbers are actually much higher. I've seen some higher estimates. And they've been openly endorsed by Republican political leaders, including Vice President Mike Pence. He actually has an endorsement on their written endorsement on their website. So from the moment I stepped into the church, I could tell that this was not a politically neutral affair. Family Research Council President Tony Perkins, who spoke at the event, said, "I believe the last election, 2016, was the result of prayer. We've seen our nation begin to move back to a nation that respects the sanctity of life." So what he's signaling here is that the issue that matters most, that pastors should care about when they're talking to their congregations, is abortion. They know that if you can get people to vote on that issue, you can control their vote. So the pastors were then instructed to form culture impact teams. The idea is for pastors to create within their churches teams of congregants that will, as they describe it, advance kingdom values in the public arena. Pastors are instructed to figure out which members of their congregations are politically active, well connected with other members, and motivated to get them to vote their so-called biblical values. And they give them tools like this to do it. This here is a culture impact team manual. It was distributed to the pastors at this event, as it is distributed to pastors around the country. See, it's got like 200 pages inside of instructions about how to do it, covering every single aspect of this initiative. So they're not just telling people to get out and vote, or telling, they're not just saying to the pastors, get congregants to get other congregants to vote. They have these resources and very sophisticated messaging materials to help them do it. The thing about these culture impact teams is that they help pastors get around IRS guidelines that say pastors can't endorse candidates from the pulpit, but nothing stops congregants from doing their own church-based political activism if it's all about culture. I interviewed a pastor about this type of initiative, and he called it a God-given loophole. He said this threads this church, the separation of church and state loophole. So I want to tell you something about the political messaging of movement leaders. When they're talking to congregants or when they're talking to pastors about congregants, it's all abortion all the time. In fact, I heard one leader tell a group of Latino pastors, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you ask them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? I mean, if they put it that way, it's like, wow, a couple extra bucks in my pocket or life itself. But when you look at the political messages in more detail, especially the messages that they're sending to one another and to elites that support them, like their deep-pocketed funders, it's not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible favors low taxes or no taxes for the rich, how the Bible favors a minimal government or no government regulation of the kind that they don't like. You know, businesses, they're happy to regulate what we can do with our bodies or who we can marry, but let's not regulate government. Let's not make rich people pay their taxes. But they also say that the Bible is against environmental regulations. They call that unbiblical. They say the Bible is against the social safety net unless the social safety net is managed by the church, which is receiving federal money for the purpose. It's really interesting. So a lot of it comes down to money. I learned a lot about that when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. I've written about him a lot. Chapter 2 of my book is about him and his ministry. So he's the founder of this Capital Ministries, which targets political leaders at the top levels of government. And he's very successful. His weekly Bible study group in the Capitol in America has been attended by at least 12 out of 15 former and current members of Trump's cabinet. He's also has Bible study groups targeting the House of Representatives and the Senate. So I was at this event, and Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue and Michelle Bachmann were there, among the many politicians delivering speeches and endorsements. There were really at least a dozen there delivering speeches or various types of endorsements. So Drollinger is arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America. The expansiveness of his positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy issues hits home the fact that this is, again, a political movement, not merely a stance in the so-called culture war. Drollinger is, of course, against progressive income taxes. He says that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. He's against government regulation of businesses, and he too has referred to environmentalism as a false religion. He actually called it a false religion in one of his Bible studies. He has this really interesting Bible study for the workforce. He's got this Bible study called Toward a Better Biblical Understanding of Lawmaking. You guys can look it up. It's on catmin.org. He's not hiding any of this. So he cites from the New Testament, the first letter of Peter 2:18, and he says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are gentle and good, or good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. And so here he explains, he cites that biblical passage about servants be submissive to your masters. And he writes, well, the economy of Rome at the time of Peter's writing was one of slave and master. The principle today of submitting to one's boss carries over. I mean, it's really kind of astonishing. It's also, by the way, you know, submitting to one's boss. I mean, this is music to the ears of movement's plutocratic funders, many of whom rely on minimal rights for the workforce and economic and environmental deregulation to maintain and increase their profits. So, you know, yes, they oppose government handouts to, but if the money flows to the churches, I think it's really important to note they're completely fine with that. You know, So under, thanks to the pandemic, unfortunately, the Trump administration is sending many millions of dollars of federal pandemic aid, perhaps billions, directly to churches and clergy, a direct payment of our tax dollars to fund religion, something that would have been unthinkable in previous decades. So what is the solution? I mean, I think in the midst of these challenges, there is plenty of hope. We're seeing a lot more political engagement today than we saw even a couple of years ago. But you simply can't affect political change without winning elections. There is no substitute for the power of the vote. I mean, they really get that. They, Ralph, one of the events I attended, Ralph Reed said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. They know that all that matters is who gets out on election day. And I think we need to understand that too. The challenges we face today are political. And so the solutions are political too. There are things we can do as individuals, like holding ourselves and members of our inner circle accountable to vote, not just in national elections, but in state and local elections too. Volunteering to help get out the vote, as one of Trump's evangelical boosters said, becoming evangelists for the vote. Leaning on elected officials to live up to their campaign promises is really important. Helping people understand that an election really isn't about the front runner, especially at the national level. It's about the justices they're going to appoint, not just to the Supreme Court, but to the federal courts, the circuits, et cetera. It's about the people they're going to tap to lead cabinets. Are they going to lead a climate denier to run the EPA? I mean, things like that. Do they believe in equality? Do they believe in pluralism? And, apart from what we can do as individuals, there are things we can achieve only if we join together, such as working with voting rights organization, which is so important given that there's been so much race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression. Getting involved in media and messaging platforms, think tanks, donating our time and energy where possible to organizations that support the separation of church and state. Religious nationalists are using the tools of democratic political culture to end democracy, but those same resources can be used to restore it. And thank you very much.
I hope you can hear the thunderous applause coming from around the world.
I can't.
Isn't that weird?
Thank you.
But yeah, not that you are waiting for the applause necessarily, but it is so funny to just say all of that into the void. So
it's all right. I know you're out there, and
yeah,
again, for being here, it's so important that we're all together to address these challenges at this difficult moment.
Yeah, there really are dozens of people on our different social media platforms listening. One comment from Facebook says, "Thank you so much for doing this important work." Louise wrote in the chat, "Thank you for touching on the brutality of capitalism that stems from the practice of enslaving people." Carrie says, "Thank you for such a clear presentation, a great wake-up call." So yeah, people are really grateful, and including me. It's a page turner, and I think your book is a page turner, and I think it strains credulity, honestly. Like, it really is sometimes difficult to imagine that this is real. And the first thing I wanted to ask you about, or maybe comment on, and see if you would reflect on this. You said something, right? Well, it's in the title of your book, first of all, but you said a second ago that this is really about power. And it occurred to me when you said that this time that I think as secularists, and I think as broadly speaking as liberals, people who believe in equality and justice for equal justice under the law, that we sometimes think that if we can just convince people that of the rightness of our position, that they'll come over to our side and be like, "Oh, you know what? You're right. I had the wrong idea." And what strikes me about the stories that you tell is that they know, these leaders, these power brokers, they know that what they're saying is completely wrong, and they don't care because it's about power for them. And I wonder what you think. Do you think that people on our side have the stomach for this, You know, I feel like it's going to require the desire to just seize power. And I think sometimes liberals feel like power is a dirty thing.
Well, that may be, but I have to say we have the numbers on our side. So, this is a minority movement. To get a handle on they don't represent a majority of the population. They represent a disproportionately empowered minority. And the way they do that is by getting the vote out in disproportionate numbers. I want to sort of talk about that a little bit. And that's why this doesn't require, you don't have to sort of steel yourself to do bad things. Do the right thing and get the vote out. So in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, and an additional number are disempowered, disenfranchised through race-based gerrymandering, voter suppression, et cetera, you don't need a majority of the population to seize the reins of power. So to get a handle on the numbers, I think we can look at the work of somebody like George Barna, who noted that the most sort of dedicated religious right supporters number only 10% of the population, but in just 10%. But and these are people who don't just get out to vote, but like make sure like their neighbors and friends get out to vote too. Like they're the ones knocking on the doors and doing that. So it's just 1 in 10. But in 2016, 91% voted, and 93% of those voted for Trump. So you see that it doesn't take a majority to win. All it takes is a small but very dedicated minority. And that works for both sides. We do, I believe, represent the silent majority of our country. I think most people of faith, indeed, reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. But they are sort of outvoted and easily divided. I mean, the movement doesn't just target likely voters to sort of turn them out to vote. They target those of us who might vote for a different candidate with sort of divisive messages like, oh, see, like I've heard people say this, oh, there's no one good to vote for. This person said something bad in 1982 or might have done this. It's sort of imperfect that way. Therefore, I'm not going to vote at all. The right knows that they're not just voting for a candidate. Like, in the run up to the midterms in 2018 and run up to 2016, I heard so many religious right leaders at these strategy meetings say this election is about judges, judges, judges. So to date, last time I checked, I think it was like a week ago or a couple weeks ago, Trump had appointed 158, like 158 of Trump's nominees had been sort of confirmed to, the federal circuits, obviously, two Supremes. He's put a stamp on nearly 25% of the federal judiciary. So elections really have consequences. Now I want to say one more thing about this. I mean, I could talk forever about it, but people sometimes accuse the left of engaging in purity politics and identity politics, but I actually think the right plays them harder. It's us versus them. The pure versus the impure. You're in or you're canceled. You're in or you're out. So this is how you build an authoritarian movement. You don't build it through compromise and consensus. You build it by compelling everyone to adhere to extreme and irrational positions, and by insisting that they declare their absolute and unwavering fealty to an extreme and irrational leader. The final thing to note here is that in their minds, this is an enemy-driven movement. That is, people who are part of it are united in their conviction that they face a diabolical enemy who represents an existential threat. And that persecution narrative is really how they build their base and how they turn out their vote. But I believe that, and they don't tolerate any dissent whatsoever, whereas people, progressives, people on the left, liberals, centrists, we often, have discussions amongst ourselves about this point or that point. We do tend to tolerate dissent. But I do believe we face an existential threat today. And we should use that to turn out the vote and have people exercise our constitutional rights and affirm our democratic principles.
So one of the questions that came in just a second ago, sort of along that line, is someone asked is there an issue that we can use to motivate voters, like the religious nationalists use the issue of abortion? Is there kind of like a a hot button that we can keep pushing to get people out to vote?
I think it would be great if people could understand the role of the judiciary. People understand that a lot of the sort of degradation of separation of church and state, the diminishment of equality, the public funding of, conservative religious initiatives. All of this is happening through the courts. And if people could understand that when you're voting for, say, for instance, a presidential candidate, it's not their character necessarily that you're voting on. You're really kind of focusing on what justices are they going to appoint, who are they going to have around them. Again, are they going to appoint a climate denier to run the EPA? Are they going to appoint people, justices who are all Federalists? Does anybody know what the Federalist Society is? It's the sort of right-wing judicial organization that plays an outsized role in grooming and promoting right-wing justices for the courts. And these justices are all sort of adhering to not only right-wing positions in the so-called culture war, but far-right economic policy. I think for years, the Christian nationalists, even starting from the slavery era, when they allied themselves with the power of the slaveholder, right? They were allying themselves with money, with the sort of kind of libertarian money that just doesn't care about humanity. For years, the religious right has allied themselves with the sort of libertarian, like far-right wing, economic wing of the Republican Party that, sort of doesn't mind the fact that, economic inequality is just, reached levels that are unsustainable in our society. I mean, there's a real irony. This is a cohort that claims to stand for family values, and yet they're endorsing economic policies that make it so much harder for families to succeed.
Well, they're just lying. I mean, I think they're using their base as pawns, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that. I think, there's a difference when you're talking about the rank and file and when you're talking about the leaders of the movement. I think that's really helpful in kind of understanding the movement. When you're talking to the rank and file, you're talking about a really disparate group of people with varying interests and concerns. And so when they're like voting to, because they want to, separate, when they're voting to like, for the candidate who's promising to end abortion or promising to reunite church and state, it's almost like they're saying something about themselves and what they value in themselves, their voting identity. But when it comes to the leadership of the movement, it's a whole different story. They are, we're talking about the heads of right-wing policy groups, networking groups, media and legislative initiatives, the data organizations. Their vision involves a lot more power for themselves and their networks and the political leaders that they support. And many of them are looking forward to a time when only Christians and their approved versions of the religion are in charge of all major areas of government and society. Some of them are Seven Mountains Dominionists, where they believe that Christians like them, they have a very narrow definition of what a Christian is, are on top of what they call the seven boulders or mountains of culture. I mean, not all Christian nationalists are Seven Mountain Dominionists, but we're seeing a kind of mainstreaming of these ideas that used to be very fringe. And they're also looking forward to a time when they can rely on government for two things. Number one, a constant flow of taxpayer money, and two, policies that privilege their religion.
Wow. Okay, another question. In your book, you talk about how religious nationalists are using the Latinx population in their stance on sex education in public schools. And I also observed that, you talk about not just the Latinx population, but how these religious nationalists are trying to broaden their appeal. You mentioned in your talk about can we find a Black woman politician who would, be subtle about it and then, be a Republican once she's elected. Can you go into that a little bit more? Because it seems like there's so many roots of this movement in racism, and yet they're also courting this diverse population who has their same religious views.
Yeah, it's really cynical, isn't it? I mean, I think Christian nationalism in America is not really separable from race and racism, no matter how hard its leaders try to do so. It's got a long history in race and racism, and it reinforces that sort of dynamic, the insider versus the outsider, the pure and the impure. Now, it's true that heads of the leading religious right-wing policy groups and their affiliated organizations are often trying to reach out to people of color, and especially pastors of color, in order to capture a subsection of voters of color. They know very well that the future of the movement can't be all white, because otherwise they would just lose elections. So they focus their efforts particularly on Latino voters of faith in specific districts in order to try and, elections are never won, they're always won at the margins. So in order, if you can change the percentage from 30% voted for Trump to 35%, then they can maybe win that district, which might help them swing an election. But it doesn't diminish the fact that the movement is driving support for a political party that has made race-based voter suppression and race-based gerrymandering a strategic imperative. And also, they're papering over the ways that racism and hyper-conservative religion tend to reinforce one another. Trump would not have won without appealing directly to the racism of so many of his supporters. And I think for substantial white majorities in these groups, the idea of religious heritage is very closely bound up with ideas of racial heritage and racial difference. So, they're sort of hearkening back to a sort of mythical past in America when, America was supposedly all conservative Christian and all, white. So they're often looking for somebody to hold up as a sort of model, a person of color that could say, see, we're not racist because we've included such and such a person in our dialogue and in our network. But it's almost like it doesn't diminish the fact that this is a movement that has long relied on the sort of idea of that insider versus the outsider. And it's almost like the lines of power, the lines between insider versus outsider are shifting so that, we can let in people of color as long as they believe rightly, completely. But if they happen to bring up inequality, if they happen to bring up the fact that if they really ask us to contend with the issue of racism in our history, in our communities, well, they're out again. I mean, they'll often cast, a lot of the leaders get involved in racial reconciliation efforts, but they'll cast racism as a sin problem. And they say, well, racism is a sin, and the only solution to sin is the gospel of Jesus. But this is a refusal to address structural inequality and structural racism. So it's a complicated picture.
We've got a little bit more time if you still have the energy for it. I heard this person says, I heard at least one podcast commentator express his denial of Christian nationalism, but he seemed more motivated by fear that it would ruin the reputation of all Christianity. Any thoughts on that? Do we have Christian allies in this?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, it's funny. It's funny for me to hear that because I feel like I do like 3 or 4 podcasts a week with progressive Christians who are really upset that they're really contending with the fact that their faith is being exploited. But this is the thing. There have always been progressive Christians or mainline Christians who are really not only not a part of this movement, really reject the sort of politics of conquest and division that it represents. I mean, I think about, just off the top of my head, look at the Moral Mondays movement. I don't know what to say when folks think that this is, maybe it's an inability to think in, in complex ways.
Yeah, no, and I think we had Rachel Lazar on as part of she was our Wednesday evening kickoff for the conference, and she talked, also about how so many Christians are part of the solution and really leading the charge for decades, on stopping this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just like off the top of my head, I had a really wonderful conversation. I think you can see it online with John Fee. He's a Messiah College professor. He's a progressive evangelical, I believe, and he's one of the folks sort of leading the charge, kind of very active in trying to highlight the fact that this is a hijacking of religion. But think about the abolitionist theologians. Okay, let's just go back. This is something that's been going on for years. Many progressive abolitionist leaders were religious, and they argued the cause of abolition from pulpits and using religious language. But at that time, and it sort of goes back to what we're seeing today. It's like, as Frederick Douglass said, it was the ministers of high standing are on the side of the slaveholder, and the abolitionist theologians, he said, represented humble pulpits. Meaning they weren't the ones who were getting the plutocratic money. They weren't part of this sort of, they weren't the ones who were sort of empowered and networked. And so there's always been, and here's the other thing about those abolitionist theologians, a lot of them promoted women's equality as well. So they were much more open to various forms of an equitable society in many different areas. And many progressive Christians today are also arguing for women's equality. And this is one of the reasons why, one of the many reasons why conservative theologians reserve some of the most poisonous words for them and call them inauthentically Christian.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a disingenuous ploy. And I think one of the great things, right, from page 1 of your book, you talk about how this is really about power. It's not really about religion. It's not really about spirituality. It's not about whether you have a heart for Jesus or whether you believe in God or anything like that. It's really about these cynical, as you said a minute ago, people who are trying to build power for themselves and their kind. And I think you do such a great job of like showing the overlap of, political power, money, the defense of capitalism at all costs, and their ability to rake in massive profits with no accountability, and racism and sexism, like all kind of in this big ball.
And science denial. I mean, we could do a whole other segment just on that.
Wow. Yeah. In fact, tonight, to close out the conference, Coven Synapathy is going to be talking about, pseudoscience and science denial. And yesterday we had Angela Saini talking about sort of the pseudoscience of race. And so, yeah, these things are all interlocking and combined together. I wanted to ask you just a couple, before we lose all the time, a couple of just sort of more personal questions. You had to, as you read the book, every chapter opens with like, I went to this banquet, or I went to this event, or I went to this fundraiser. And I'm thinking to myself, how did you do it? I can barely watch 5 minutes of a YouTube video of some guy like this talking before I want to pull my hair out.
Well, I think that, I just went places I was allowed to go, or places where I was invited. Sometimes I was invited by people who are movement leaders and know that I'm an opposition journalist, but invited me anyway, which I'm grateful for. The Values Voters Conferences, the Road to Majority conferences, everybody can just go. You just buy a ticket. Marches for Life, everybody can go. I've been, researching this movement for a dozen years. And I really feel like from the very moment that I started looking into it, I could see that it posed an existential threat to our democracy. And now in particular, I think we're kind of at a all hands on deck moment. And I feel like I have to do my part.
Yeah. I was, thinking that with recent events, the last 2 months since the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings around the country, that you've probably been looking back at the things you've researched over the years and thought, this is like a pinnacle moment. Like, how do you put in perspective what's happening right now with respect to all this research that you've done?
Well, when I started researching this movement a dozen years ago, it was really around the issue of public education. I was looking at these after-school clubs targeting kindergartners and saying, this represents an existential threat to our democracy. And I was like, what? Obama's the president? What are you talking about?
Right, yeah.
But I could see that the legal movement that was sort of had made the placement of these good news clubs in public schools possible was on a tear. They were operating much under the radar of progressives who would say, wait a second, we have the ACLU. I was like, no, it's not the same thing. They had sort of put into place these over, time, and very consciously and very carefully, these novel legal building blocks, these novel legal sort of theories that created these building blocks that led up over a period of about 15 years to a sort of reconceived understanding of what religion is. They said that these laws were legal, these clubs were legal in public schools, thanks to, they conceived of basically religion as just speech from a certain point of view. And this sort of ruling about these sort of after school fundamentalist clubs in public schools was a kind of complete evisceration of establishment clause concerns. And I could see how this sort of idea was going to be used over time to degrade the separation of church and state in every area of our society, or could be used. And I could also see that progressives were largely unaware of it, really unaware of the sort of machinery of the movement, that this is, some people say, is this a conspiracy? It's not a conspiracy. Conspiracies happen under the cover of darkness with unnamed actors. This is happening out in the open. It's not that they're hiding. It's that
broad daylight.
We're not listening. So we need to start listening.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes liberals are naive in the sense that we think that the good will just win the day or something, and there's a struggle, and I wonder, in closing, whether you think that the current administration has, with the uprisings now and the federal officers deployed in Portland, and the threats of federal officers being deployed in Chicago and Baltimore and other cities, whether you think there's some overreach going on, whether they've gotten out a little over ahead of their feet, and whether you think that this is sort of the last gasp of a dying movement, or you think that people are going to fall for it.
I don't think anybody can see this as the last gasp of a dying movement. It has more power than it's ever had. And, they have, managed at the very least to, capture a large portion of the courts. That's going to have consequences for decades, for a generation.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time, and there were a lot of questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. And I want to just encourage you to follow Katherine on Twitter. I'm going to put her Twitter handle in the chat. It's Kath Stewart, Kath S. Stewart.
And if people have additional questions, please email me through my website. You can contact me. It's goodnewskatherine.me, and there's a contact. And if you just hit the contact, and if you have additional questions,
goodnewskatherine.me.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's not goodnewskatherine. It's katherinestewart.me. Okay. Katherinestewart.me. I apologize.
Katherinestewart.me. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So following this, in just a few minutes, we're going to have Andrew Seidel from the Freedom from Religion Foundation on, and he's written a similar but distinctly different book called The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. So also about Christian nationalism, but more about the history of the founding of the nation and the myth that that is often used by the Christian nationalist movement, that from its roots, this is a Christian nationalist or a Christian country.
It's an incredible book. So it
is
amazing.
Yeah, so stick around. Actually, don't stick around. We're going to end this, but then join us again on the website, secularstudents.org/2020 conference. You can find the video feed there or in our social platforms. And in about 15 minutes, less than 15 minutes, we'll be back with Andrew Seidel. Thank you, Katherine, so much. This has been fantastic. We could have gone for another hour, but have a great rest of your Saturday.
Thanks, you as well. Thanks to everybody for joining.
And thank you for joining, everyone. Yes. Bye-bye.